At the Battle of Midway on June 4, 1942, Japanese dive bombers from the carrier Hiryu attacked the USS Yorktown and scored 3 direct hits. One bomb tore a 10-foot hole in the flight deck. Another went down the funnel stack and blew out 5 of 6 boilers, killing every man in the fire rooms. The third started a fire near the aviation gasoline handling system. The Japanese pilots flew back to the Hiryu and reported a burning stationary American carrier, dead in the water and listing. 2.5 hours later, the Hiryu launched a second strike of 10 torpedo bombers against the American fleet. The pilots found a carrier that was steaming at 20 knots, launching fighters, and showed no signs of recent damage. They attacked it, hitting it with 2 torpedoes. They flew back to the Hiryu and reported that they had struck a second American carrier. They had not struck a second carrier. They had struck the Yorktown again. The same ship the first wave had reported as destroyed was operational, making speed and putting planes in the air less than 3 hours after taking 3 bomb hits. The Japanese pilots could not reconcile what they had seen with what they were seeing. A carrier that had been burning and listing should not have been launching aircraft. The only explanation that fit their operational experience was that this must be a different ship. It was not a different ship. It was American damage control. If you're watching this and finding it interesting, it would mean a lot if you hit subscribe. We make content like this every week, and your support helps us keep going. The reason the Yorktown was operational 2 hours after taking 3 direct hits, while 4 Japanese carriers died the same afternoon from comparable damage, is traceable to a single technical innovation implemented by a single officer in the weeks between the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway. At Coral Sea on May 8, 1942, the carrier USS Lexington was hit by 2 torpedoes and several bombs. The initial damage was survivable. The ship maintained power, maintained speed, and continued to recover aircraft. Then, approximately an hour after the attack, gasoline vapors from ruptured aviation fuel lines accumulated in enclosed spaces below the hangar deck reached a motor generator room and detonated. The secondary explosions were catastrophic. They blew out the ship's internal structure, started fires that the damage control teams could not contain, and killed the men who were trying to contain them. The Lexington sank that evening, not because of the bombs and torpedoes, but because of the gasoline vapors that nobody had vented. Machinist Oscar W. Myers, the air fuel officer aboard the Yorktown, watched the Lexington burn. He was an engineering petty officer, not a commander, not a designer, not someone whose name appeared in operational summaries or battle plans. What he understood from watching the Lexington die was that the aviation fuel lines that ran from the storage tanks deep in the ship to the flight deck, where the aircraft were fueled before launch, retained gasoline vapor in the pipes even when fuel was not flowing. The vapor was heavier than air, so it pooled in low spaces and waited there until a bomb or a torpedo ruptured the pipe or jarred a fitting loose, at which point the vapor found an ignition source and the ship was finished. Myers designed a system to purge the fuel lines with carbon dioxide. When the ship went to general quarters, which happened before every combat engagement, the fuel handling crew would pump all gasoline in the topside lines back down to the storage tanks and then flood the empty lines with CO2, displacing the vapor with inert gas. The storage tanks themselves were blanketed with CO2 as well, creating an atmosphere inside the tanks in which gasoline could not ignite, regardless of what happened to the structure around them. The system was installed on the Yorktown in the 3 days the ship spent at Pearl Harbor between Coral Sea and Midway. 3 days. The Yorktown had come back from Coral Sea with a bomb hole in her flight deck and structural damage that the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard estimated would take 90 days to repair. Admiral Nimitz gave them 3. 1,400 shipyard workers swarmed over the carrier around the clock and sent her back to sea in 72 hours with watertight integrity restored and Myers' CO2 purging system operational. It was the system, more than the hull repairs, that saved the ship at Midway. When the Japanese bombs struck the Yorktown on the morning of June 4th, the aviation fuel lines had already been purged. The bomb that landed near the gasoline handling system started a fire in a rag store, which the CO2 drench system contained before it could reach the fuel compartments. The bomb that went down the funnel stack killed the boiler crews but did not ignite the fuel bunkers. The bomb that tore the flight deck open destroyed 2 gun positions but did not start a secondary fire because there was nothing volatile left in the spaces below the flight deck to ignite. The damage control teams fought the fires they had and did not face the fires they would have faced if the fuel lines had been full of vapor. The flight deck was patched in under 2 hours. The boilers were relit. The Yorktown was making 20 knots and launching fighters when the second Japanese strike arrived. Aboard the 4 Japanese carriers that morning, the situation was the opposite, and the difference was the same system the Americans had and the Japanese did not. When dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown struck the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu between 10:22 and 10:28 on June 4th, the hits were concentrated on the flight and hangar decks, where the Japanese carriers had aircraft armed, fueled, and in various stages of preparation for launch. The bombs penetrated the flight decks and detonated among the aircraft and the ordnance and the fuel. The aviation gasoline ignited. The fires spread through the hangar decks and down into the ship through the fuel lines and ventilation systems that had not been purged, had not been blanketed with inert gas, and had not been designed with the assumption that a bomb would eventually reach them. The Japanese damage control organization on each carrier consisted of a specialized cadre of engineering personnel trained specifically for damage control duty. These men were assigned to damage control stations throughout the ship and were responsible for firefighting, counterflooding, and structural repair. The problem with this organization, which was competent on paper and had been effective in peacetime exercises, was that the damage control stations were located inside the ship in the spaces most likely to be destroyed by the initial bomb hits. When the bombs struck the Akagi's hangar deck and started fires among the armed and fueled aircraft, the damage control cadre assigned to that section of the ship was killed or incapacitated in the first minutes. There was no backup because the Japanese system did not train the entire crew in damage control the way the American system did. Ordinary Japanese sailors were not taught firefighting or counterflooding or the operation of portable pumps. They were taught their specific duty station and nothing else. When the specialists died, the institutional knowledge of how to save the ship died with them. The American system was different in a way that reflected a deeper difference in how the two navies thought about damage. The U.S. Navy trained every sailor aboard a carrier in basic damage control. Every man knew where the nearest fire hose was, how to operate a portable pump, and how to activate the CO2 systems and the counterflooding valves. The damage control organization was layered and redundant. If the primary team was killed, the backup team took over, and if the backup was killed, the nearest sailors formed an ad hoc team and did what they could. The training was relentless, repetitive, and unglamorous. It was the least popular part of shipboard life. And at Midway, it was the reason the Yorktown was launching fighters while the Akagi was burning to the waterline. The Japanese had discovered the vulnerability of their own aviation fuel systems at Coral Sea, where the Shokaku took 2 bomb hits that started fires reaching the gasoline storage tanks. The Shokaku survived because her crew managed to contain the fires manually, but the implication was obvious. The fuel system was a critical vulnerability that required a technical solution. The finding was not distributed to the other carriers. The Naval History and Heritage Command's assessment is direct. The Japanese discovered at Midway, and the Americans with the loss of WASP, how easily water mains could be broken by shock and fire curtains destroyed by splinters. The Japanese learned what had gone wrong aboard Shokaku and then did not distribute the finding to the rest of the fleet. The Americans learned what had gone wrong aboard Lexington and had the solution installed on the Yorktown within 3 weeks. The gap between those two institutional responses is the gap between 4 carriers sunk and 1 carrier saved. The Essex-class carriers that replaced the Yorktown class, beginning in 1943, incorporated every damage control lesson the Navy had learned from Coral Sea, Midway, and the loss of the Wasp and Hornet in the Solomons campaign. The Essex class had an open hangar deck, meaning the sides of the hangar were fitted with large roll-up doors that could be opened to vent smoke, heat, and explosive gases overboard in seconds. The Japanese carriers had enclosed hangars, which trapped heat and gases and turned the hangar deck into a sealed chamber in which fires fed on themselves. The Essex class had multiple redundant firefighting systems, sprinklers, fog nozzles, foam generators, portable pumps, and a CO2 drench system that could flood any compartment in the ship with inert gas within minutes of a fire being reported. The flight deck was armored on later variants. The fuel storage was separated by cofferdams and blanketed with CO2. The result was a class of carrier that could absorb damage that would have sunk any Japanese carrier in the fleet and continue operating. The Essex-class carriers were hit by bombs, kamikazes, and torpedoes throughout 1944 and 1945. None were sunk. Some came close. The Bunker Hill was hit by 2 kamikazes on May 11, 1945, killing 346 men and starting fires that burned for 5 hours. She survived. The Intrepid was hit by kamikazes 4 separate times across the war. She survived every time and returned to service. The Franklin, hit by 2 550-pound bombs on March 19, 1945, lost 724 men, suffered the highest casualties of any surviving U.S. warship, and still made it back to the Brooklyn Navy Yard under her own power. The Franklin's survival was the ultimate test of the damage control system. When the bombs hit, 31 fully armed and fueled aircraft were on the flight deck preparing for launch. The explosions ignited their fuel tanks and set off their ordnance, including Tiny Tim air-to-surface rockets whose motors ignited and sent them screaming across the hangar deck. Machine gun ammunition cooked off in all directions. The fires reached temperatures that melted steel fittings and buckled deck plating. The ship lost all radio communication, took a 13-degree list, and drifted to within 52 miles of the Japanese mainland. The crew saved her. Hundreds of men fought the fires for hours, jettisoning burning ordnance over the side, dragging wounded shipmates through smoke-filled passageways, and manning hoses connected to systems that the design engineers had installed specifically for this scenario. Father Joseph O'Callahan, the ship's Catholic chaplain, moved through the fires administering last rites, organizing firefighting parties, and helping carry hot bombs to the deck edge for disposal. He received the Medal of Honor. The cruiser Santa Fe came alongside the burning carrier and poured water onto the fires from her own hoses while taking stretcher cases and walking wounded across to her decks. By late afternoon, the fires were under control. The engineering crew got 2 of 4 shafts running. The Franklin steamed home at 25 knots. The Bureau of Ships War Damage Report for the Franklin, published after the war, concluded that the damage sustained was about the maximum to be expected from fires and detonations of large numbers of bombs and rockets on the flight and hangar decks when a carrier having heavily armed, fully fueled planes aboard is hit by 1 or more bombs properly placed. It then stated what the entire damage control system had been designed to prove, that the basic design and construction of the Essex class, developed prior to World War II, and therefore without the benefit of war experience, was favorably reflected in the manner in which Franklin absorbed heavy damage. The ship that absorbed the worst punishment of any carrier in the war and survived had been designed before the war started. The damage control system that saved it had been developed from lessons learned at Coral Sea, Midway, and the Solomons. The CO2 purging innovation that began the chain had been invented by a machinist whose name does not appear in most histories of the Pacific War. The training that put fire hoses in the hands of every sailor aboard had been mandated by an institutional culture that believed, unlike the Japanese Navy's culture, that saving the ship was everyone's job and not a specialist's privilege. The Japanese Navy never closed the damage control gap. Their carriers continued to burn and sink when hit, from Midway through the Philippine Sea to the final kamikaze attacks of 1945, because the institutional risk to the vulnerability identified at Coral Sea was never implemented at the fleet level. The finding sat in the Shokaku's after-action report. The CO2 purging system sat in Machinist Myers's engineering drawings. One Navy built a system around the discovery. The other filed the report and lost 4 carriers in an afternoon.